Sometimes grief is so heavy it drives a man into the wilderness to disappear forever. After losing his only son to a hunting accident, 67-year-old Everett Miles walked away from his ranch, his community, and nearly his own life. For 3 winters, he's lived alone in a remote cabin in the Wyoming backcountry, speaking to no one. But one frozen night changed everything. He found 2 orphaned wolf pups whimpering by a creek, barely alive. What began as simple mercy became something deeper, a bond that healed wounds no doctor could touch. The wolves didn't just keep him warm, they gave him a reason to live again. But what happens when outsiders threaten the only family he has left? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind came down from the Absaroka Range like a living thing, howling through the lodgepole pines and rattling the weathered boards of the cabin. Everett Miles stood at the window, watching snow devils dance across the clearing. His breath fogged the glass. Outside, the thermometer nailed to the porch post read 14 below zero. February in the Wyoming backcountry didn't forgive weakness. He moved to the cast-iron stove, adding 2 pieces of split pine to the fire. The wood caught quickly, sending up sparks that reminded him of fireflies, the kind Thomas used to chase through the summer meadows back when the ranch was still a home, and not just a memory he couldn't bear to face. The cabin was small, 1 room, maybe 400 square feet, with a sleeping loft accessible by a rough-hewn ladder. Everett had built it himself 20 years ago as a hunting camp, back when he'd bring Thomas up here every autumn. They'd track elk through the timber, cook over an open fire, and sleep under wool blankets that smelled like wood smoke and old canvas. Those were good days. Days when being a father felt natural as breathing. Now the cabin was something else entirely. It was a refuge, a prison, a place to hide from the world and the judgment he imagined in every familiar face. His morning routine never varied. Wake before dawn, feed the fire, boil coffee strong enough to strip paint, check his traps and snares in a 3-mile circuit through the forest, return before noon, split firewood, melt snow for water, read by lamplight until his eyes grew heavy, sleep alone in the loft with only the wind for company. 3 winters he'd lived this way. 3 winters since he'd spoken more than a handful of words to another human being. The silence had become comfortable, like an old coat worn soft with age. On the wall above his makeshift table hung a faded photograph in a simple wooden frame. Everett looked at it every morning and every night, though he couldn't say why. Maybe it was punishment, maybe it was prayer. The photograph showed 3 people standing in front of a white ranch house with a broad porch and a red metal roof. A younger version of himself, lean and strong, one arm around a woman with kind eyes and auburn hair going silver at the temples. Sarah, his wife, gone 8 years now to cancer that ate through her like fire through dry grass, and beside them, a boy of maybe 12 years old, grinning wide, gap-toothed, holding up a string of brook trout. Thomas, his son, his only child, the one person he'd loved more than his own life and failed to protect when it mattered most. Everett turned away from the photograph. Some mornings it was harder to look at than others. He pulled on his winter gear, wool long johns, thick canvas pants, a flannel shirt worn thin at the elbows, a heavy sheepskin coat that had belonged to his grandfather, fur-lined boots, a wool cap pulled low over his ears. He took his rifle from the pegs by the door, checked the action out of habit, and stepped into the cold. The world outside was pristine and merciless. Snow covered everything in smooth, undulating drifts that caught the early light and threw it back in shades of blue and purple. The sky overhead was that particular shade of pale winter blue that seems to go on forever. No clouds. That meant the temperature would drop even further come nightfall. Everett made his way along the trail he'd packed down through weeks of walking the same route. His breath came in white plumes. Ice crystals formed on his beard. The forest was quiet, except for the crunch of his boots and the occasional crack of a tree branch surrendering to the weight of accumulated snow. He'd left Pine Ridge 3 years ago in the middle of October, just walked away from everything. The ranch, 2,000 acres of good grazing land along Sweetwater Creek, was being managed by his foreman, Jack Hollister, a decent man who'd worked for Everett for 15 years. Jack sent monthly reports to a lawyer in town, who deposited the ranch's modest income into an account Everett never touched. The cattle were sold off. The horses too, except for one old mare named Juniper, who'd been Sarah's favorite. She was pastured with a neighbor now. The people of Pine Ridge had tried to help at first. After the funeral, they'd come by with casseroles and condolences, their eyes full of pity and careful words. Reverend Michaels, the sheriff, old friends from the Cattlemen's Association, even Emma Thornton, who'd taught Thomas in elementary school and wept openly at the service. Everett had accepted their kindness with nods and one-word answers, but inside he was already gone, already planning his retreat, because he knew what they were too polite to say, that he was the reason Thomas was dead, that a better father would have seen it coming, would have prevented it, would have done something, anything different. The hunting accident happened on a cold November morning. Thomas was 19, home from his first semester at the University of Wyoming. They'd gone up into the high country after mule deer, just the two of them, like they'd done a dozen times before. Thomas was a good shot, careful and patient. Everett had taught him well, but something went wrong. Thomas was crossing a steep ravine when the rocks gave way beneath him. Everett heard the shot, a single crack that echoed through the canyon, and then silence. By the time he reached him, Thomas was already gone, his rifle lying 15 feet away, where it had fallen and discharged on impact. The bullet had caught him in the chest. Death would have been quick. That's what the sheriff said later. As if it was supposed to be a comfort, Everett carried his son's body 4 miles back to the truck, carried him like he'd carried him as a baby, as a sleeping child after long summer days. Carried him, knowing that every step was another he'd failed to prevent, another moment he'd never get back, another chance to save his boy that he'd somehow missed. The official report called it a tragic accident. No one's fault, just bad luck and bad timing, and the kind of thing that happens in wild country when you push your luck too far. But Everett knew better. He'd been the one to suggest that particular canyon. He'd been the one who'd said the crossing looked safe enough. He'd been the one who was supposed to keep his son safe, and he'd failed at the only job that truly mattered. After the funeral, he'd lasted 2 weeks in the ranch house before the walls started closing in. Sarah's things were still everywhere. Her reading glasses on the kitchen table, her jacket hanging by the door, her scent still faint in the bedroom they'd shared for 34 years. And Thomas's room was exactly as he'd left it. His bed unmade, his college textbooks stacked on the desk, a half-finished letter to a girl he'd been sweet on, tucked into a notebook. Everett couldn't breathe in that house, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't look at himself in the mirror without seeing a failure, a fraud, a man who'd lost everything that made him worth knowing. So he'd packed a truck with supplies, driven up the old logging road as far as it would go, and hiked the final 8 miles to this cabin with everything he could carry on his back. He'd left a note for Jack, 3 words, "Don't come looking," and to Jack's credit, or maybe his wisdom, he hadn't. Now Everett checked his trapline, 3 snowshoe hares and a pine marten, enough to keep him fed for a few days. He reset the snares with cold-numbed fingers and moved on through the forest, following paths only he knew, reading the woods the way some men read newspapers. He saw signs everywhere. Elk had moved through here recently, their tracks cutting deep into the snow. A mountain lion had marked a tree 100 yards from his cabin. Ravens watched him from the high branches, their black eyes knowing and patient. This was their world. He was just a guest, and not a particularly welcome one. By the time he returned to the cabin, the sun had climbed to its weak winter zenith. Everett skinned the hares and the marten, working with the careful precision of someone who'd done this task 1,000 times. The pelts he'd stretch and cure, trade them eventually to a man who came up from Jackson Hole twice a year with supplies. The meat he'd cook slow over the fire with wild onions and the last of his potatoes. Inside, he built up the fire again and set water to boil. His hands were stiff from the cold, and his knees ached the way they always did in winter. 67 wasn't old, not really, but it wasn't young either. The years had a way of accumulating when you weren't paying attention, adding up to a sum that surprised you when you finally did the math. He thought about his father, who died at 71 of a heart attack while mending fence. Just dropped dead in the middle of a sunny afternoon, wire cutters still in his hand. His mother had found him at sunset, lying peaceful in the grass like he'd decided to take a nap. That was 30 years ago. Seemed like yesterday. Seemed like forever. Sarah used to say that time was funny that way. The things you wanted to remember faded, and the things you wanted to forget stayed sharp as broken glass. She'd been right about that. She'd been right about most things. Everett ate his supper, standing at the window, watching the light fade from the sky. The temperature was already dropping. Tonight would be brutal. He added more wood to the fire and climbed the ladder to the loft, where his sleeping bag and a pile of wool blankets waited. Before he slept, he looked at the photograph one more time. Sarah's smile. Thomas's bright eyes. The ranch house in the background, white and solid and permanent looking. All of it gone now, or might as well be. All of it lost to time and circumstance and his own inability to protect what mattered. He closed his eyes against the familiar weight of grief and guilt. Tomorrow would be like today, and the day after that, and the day after that. An endless succession of identical days, each one a small penance, a tiny payment against a debt he could never fully repay. Outside, the wind picked up again, moaning through the pines like something alive and hurting. Everett listened to it until he fell asleep, dreaming of nothing, which was a mercy in itself. The sound came to him in the deepest part of the night, cutting through the wind's constant howl. At first Everett thought it was part of a dream, a thin, desperate crying that reminded him of a child in distress. But then he was fully awake, sitting up in the darkness of the loft, his heart hammering against his ribs. He listened. The wind had died down to almost nothing, and in the stillness he heard it again. A whimpering, high-pitched and weak, coming from somewhere outside. Everett climbed down the ladder, his joints protesting. The fire had burned down to embers, casting barely enough light to navigate by. He pulled on his boots and coat, grabbed his rifle and a battery-powered lantern, and stepped out into the night. The cold hit him like a physical blow. The temperature had dropped to at least 20 below, maybe colder. The sky was clear and full of stars, so many they looked like spilled salt across black cloth. His breath froze in the air before him. The sound came again, closer than he'd thought. Maybe 50 yards away down toward the creek. Everett made his way carefully through the snow, following the crying. His lantern threw wild shadows across the drifts. The beam caught the dark line of the creek, mostly frozen over, except for a narrow channel in the center, where the current ran too fast to ice up completely. And there, huddled against a fallen log on the near bank, were two small shapes, wolf pups. Couldn't be more than 8 or 10 weeks old. Their eyes caught the lantern light and threw it back in shades of green and gold. They were shivering so hard Everett could see it from 10 feet away. He approached slowly, the rifle ready but not raised. Wolves were rare in this part of Wyoming, though they'd been making a comeback in recent years. These pups were too young to be out on their own, which meant something had happened to their mother. The pups watched him come, too cold and weak to run. One of them, the slightly larger of the two, tried to bare its teeth, but the effect was more pitiful than threatening. They were starving. Everett could see their ribs standing out sharply beneath thin fur, matted with ice. He knelt in the snow a few feet away and studied them. The larger pup was mostly gray, with black markings around its face. The smaller one was lighter, almost silver in the lantern light. Both of them had the oversized paws and ears that marked them as juveniles. Both of them were dying. Everett knew he should walk away. Let nature take its course. These weren't pets. They were wild animals, predators, and they'd grow into creatures that could kill a full-grown elk. Bringing them into his cabin would be foolish at best, dangerous at worst. But as he looked at them shivering in the snow, something shifted inside his chest. They were orphans, alone in the world, left behind by circumstances beyond their control. And they were going to die tonight if someone didn't help them, just like Thomas had died because Everett hadn't been able to help him when it mattered. The thought came unbidden and unwelcome, but once it arrived, it wouldn't leave. These pups hadn't asked to be abandoned, hadn't done anything to deserve this slow, frozen death. They were innocent, just trying to survive in a world that had turned suddenly hostile. Everett set down the rifle and shrugged out of his heavy coat. The cold bit into him immediately through his flannel shirt, but he ignored it. He spread the coat on the snow and began talking in a low, steady voice. "Easy now, easy. Not going to hurt you. Just trying to help is all." The pups watched him with those luminous eyes, their bodies trembling. The smaller one whimpered again, a sound that cut straight through to something Everett thought he'd buried beyond reach. He moved slowly, carefully, and scooped up the larger pup first. It tried to struggle, but it was too weak. Its body was cold through the thin fur, and Everett could feel its heart beating fast and desperate against his hands. He wrapped it in one side of the coat. The smaller pup didn't even fight when he picked it up, just sagged against his chest, shivering. He wrapped it in the other side of the coat and stood, cradling both pups against his body. They were surprisingly light, couldn't weigh more than 10 or 12 pounds each. He could feel them shaking, their small bodies fighting against the cold that had nearly claimed them. Everett picked up the lantern and made his way back to the cabin, moving as quickly as he dared through the snow. His shirt was soaked with sweat and melted ice by the time he shouldered through the door. He kicked it shut behind him and went straight to the stove. The embers were still hot. He fed in kindling and pine, working one-handed while keeping the pups bundled in his coat. The fire caught and grew, pushing back the darkness and cold. Only then did Everett unwrap the coat and examine his unexpected guests properly. They were in bad shape. Their eyes were dull, their breathing shallow. The smaller one's gums were pale, a sign of hypothermia or blood loss or both. Everett laid them carefully on the coat near the stove and went to work. He doctored animals his whole life. Cattle, horses, sheep, dogs, even a barn owl, once that Thomas had found with a broken wing. The principles were the same. Warmth first, then hydration, then food, if they could keep it down. He filled a pot with snow and set it on the stove to melt. While he waited, he rubbed the pups down with a towel, trying to get their circulation moving. They didn't resist, just lay there accepting his ministrations with the patience of creatures too exhausted to care. When the water was warm, not hot, but body temperature, he dipped his fingers in it and let each pup lick the moisture from his hand. They did so eagerly, their small pink tongues rough against his skin. He gave them more, a little at a time, until they'd had maybe half a cup each. The larger pup was already showing signs of improvement. Its eyes were brighter, and it had stopped shivering quite so violently. The smaller one was more concerning. It had drunk the water, but it still lay limp and unresponsive, its breathing ragged. Everett had some elk meat left from 2 days ago. He cut it into tiny pieces and tried to get the pups to eat. The larger one snapped at the meat, missed, tried again, and finally managed to swallow a piece. The smaller one just looked at the meat with dull eyes. He pushed a small piece into its mouth and held it shut gently until the pup swallowed reflexively. Then another piece, and another. After 5 or 6 pieces, it seemed to realize what was happening and started eating on its own. Slowly, each swallow a visible effort. Everett sat back and watched them eat. Outside, the wind had started up again, but inside the cabin it was warm and quiet, except for the crackle of the fire and the small sounds of the pups feeding. What was he doing? He'd come up here to be alone, to punish himself with solitude and silence, to live out whatever years he had left in this self-imposed exile. And now he'd just brought 2 wild animals into his cabin, creatures that would grow into predators weighing 150 pounds. Capable of taking down a bull elk. But as he watched the smaller pup finally lift its head and look at him with something approaching alertness, he felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. A sense of purpose. A reason to stay alive that extended beyond simple survival. These pups needed him. It was that simple and that complicated. They would die without his help. And maybe, just maybe, helping them was a way to atone for the help he hadn't been able to give his own son. The larger pup finished eating and took a few wobbly steps toward Everett, sniffed his hand, and then, to his surprise, curled up against his leg. The smaller one watched this, seemed to consider it, and then did the same on the other side. Everett sat very still, hardly breathing, as the two pups pressed against him, seeking warmth and safety. Their small bodies were finally starting to warm up, their shivers subsiding into the occasional tremor. Within minutes, both of them were asleep. He should move them, put them in a box or something, maintain some distance, but he couldn't bring himself to disturb them. So he sat there on the floor by the stove, his back against the wall, two wolf pups sleeping trustingly against his legs, and felt something crack open in his chest that had been locked tight for longer than he could remember. Outside, the temperature continued to drop. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, and inside the cabin, 3 orphans, 1 human, 2 wolf, survived another night in the wilderness together. The first week was touch and go. The smaller pup, Everett started thinking of it as Shadow because of the way it followed the other one everywhere, developed a cough that rattled in its small chest. He stayed up 2 nights straight, keeping the fire hot, holding Shadow wrapped in blankets while the pup wheezed and shook. On the 3rd morning, the cough broke. Shadow coughed up thick mucus and then, for the first time, looked at Everett with clear, bright eyes and wagged its tail. Just a small movement, barely perceptible, but it hit Everett harder than he'd expected. The larger pup, he'd taken to calling it Ash for its grey and black colouring, was stronger from the start. By the end of the first week, Ash was exploring every corner of the cabin, chewing on everything it could reach, and had already figured out how to climb the ladder to the loft. Everett would hear scrabbling sounds overhead and find Ash up there, tangled in his blankets, looking pleased with itself. He carved wooden bowls from a section of pine log and filled them with water and whatever meat he had on hand. The pups ate like they'd never seen food before, which maybe they hadn't, at least not in any reliable quantity. They put on weight quickly. Their coats thickened and gained luster. The movements became stronger, more coordinated, and they bonded to Everett with an intensity that surprised him. Wherever he went in the cabin, at least one of them was at his heels. When he went outside to check the traps or gather firewood, both pups would sit in the doorway and watch, whining until he returned. At night, they slept pressed against him in the loft, their small bodies radiating heat, their soft breathing a counterpoint to his own. Everett hadn't spoken more than a handful of words in 3 years, but he found himself talking to the pups constantly, explaining what he was doing as he prepared their food, telling them about the weather as he split firewood, even reading aloud from the battered paperback westerns he kept on a shelf, just to fill the silence with something other than wind. Says here that a good cowboy always takes care of his horse first, he'd read, while Ash and Shadow curled at his feet. Sees to its water and feed before he thinks about his own comfort. That's the code, you see. You look after what depends on you. He'd pause then, the weight of those words settling over him. He hadn't looked after Thomas, hadn't protected him when it mattered. But maybe, and this was a dangerous thought he knew, maybe he could do right by these 2 orphans who'd stumbled into his life. The wooden bowls he'd carved became a kind of ritual. Every morning and every evening, he'd prepare their food carefully, making sure they had enough, but not so much they'd gorge themselves sick. He'd set the bowls down in the same spot each time, near the stove where it was warmest. The pups learned the routine quickly, waiting with barely contained excitement while he prepared their meals. Shadow remained the smaller and more cautious of the 2, always watching before acting, always checking Everett's face for reassurance. Ash was bolder, more confident, the natural leader. But even Ash would look to Everett for guidance when something new or uncertain appeared. They were learning to trust him. And in the process, Everett was learning something too, that he was capable of keeping something alive, that his hands could nurture instead of just failing, that maybe he wasn't completely worthless after all. The thought came to him one morning while he was watching the pups play fight near the stove. They tumbled over each other, mock growling and nipping, their movements full of joy and energy. When was the last time he'd felt joy? When was the last time he'd allowed himself to feel anything but guilt and grief? He couldn't remember. The answer was somewhere back before Thomas died. Back in a life that seemed to belong to someone else entirely, but watching Ash pin Shadow and then let the smaller pup reverse the position, watching them roll and wrestle with complete abandon, Everett felt something close to contentment. It wasn't happiness exactly. The grief was still there, always would be, but it had moved over, made room for something else, something new and fragile and worth protecting. By the second week, the pups were strong enough to venture outside. Everett wrapped them in pieces of an old wool blanket, cut and sewn crudely into makeshift coats, and let them explore the area around the cabin. They bounded through the snow, diving into drifts and emerging covered in white powder, their eyes bright with excitement. Shadow stayed closer to the cabin, more cautious about this vast new world. But Ash ranged farther, investigating every tree and rock, leaving trails of small paw prints in the snow. Everett watched them from the porch, his rifle nearby out of habit, though he doubted he'd need it. Any predator with sense would avoid the scent of both human and wolf. The pups tired quickly those first few outings, and Everett would carry them back inside, one under each arm, their small bodies warm and trusting against his chest. They'd sleep for hours afterward, curled together near the fire, while Everett went about his daily tasks, checking traps, hauling water, splitting wood. But even as he worked, he was aware of them, listening for their breathing, checking to make sure they were still there, still safe. It was a feeling he recognized from long ago, from when Thomas was a baby and Sarah would leave Everett alone with him for a few hours. That constant awareness of another life depending on you, that weight of responsibility that was somehow also a gift. The wooden bowl sat beside the stove now, empty and waiting for the evening meal. Everett had carved his initials into the bottom of each one, E.M., though he couldn't say exactly why. Maybe just to mark them as his, maybe to have something to leave behind when he was gone. The pups would need those bowls for months yet, until they were big enough to hunt on their own, if he let them go. If he could bring himself to release them back into the wild when the time came. But that was thinking too far ahead. For now, they were here. They were alive. They were his responsibility and his redemption, all wrapped up in two small bodies that trusted him completely. Shadow sneezed in its sleep, and Ash's ear twitched in response. Everett sat in his chair watching them, his coffee going cold in his hand, and allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in 3 long years. Hope, small and tentative and probably foolish. But hope nonetheless. Outside, the winter continued its grip on the land. But inside the cabin, something was thawing that had nothing to do with the temperature. And Everett Miles, who'd come to the wilderness to die alone, found himself with reasons to live that he'd never expected to find. 3 weeks in, Ash tried to run away. It happened on a morning when the sun was out and the temperature had climbed all the way to 20 degrees above zero, practically balmy for late February. Everett had the pups outside while he split wood, and Ash caught the scent of something on the wind. An elk, probably, or maybe a deer moving through the timber. The pup's whole body went rigid, nose pointed toward the forest. Then before Everett could react, Ash was running, a grey streak disappearing into the pines. Ash, Everett shouted, dropping the axe. Ash, come back! But the pup kept going, driven by instincts older than any training Everett had attempted. Shadow stood beside Everett, whining anxiously, looking from him to the forest and back again. Everett grabbed his rifle and plunged into the woods after Ash. The snow was deep and unpacked here, and he sank to his knees with every step. His breath came hard. His heart hammered. All he could think was that he'd failed again, let another living thing slip through his fingers, proved himself incapable of keeping anything safe. He followed Ash's trail through the snow, calling the pup's name, until his voice went hoarse. The tracks led him nearly a mile from the cabin, up a steep slope and into a dense stand of spruce. And there, at the base of a granite outcropping, he found Ash. The pup was lying on its side, whimpering. It had tried to jump across a gap between 2 rocks and missed, falling 8 feet onto frozen ground. Its front left leg was bent at an unnatural angle. Everett knelt beside Ash, his hands shaking as he examined the injury. The leg was broken, no question. A clean break from the feel of it, but a break nonetheless. The pup looked at him with pain-filled eyes and whimpered again, a sound that went straight through Everett's chest. "I know," he said softly. "I know it hurts, but you're going to be all right. I've got you now." He fashioned a makeshift splint from 2 straight branches and strips torn from his shirt, working carefully while Ash trembled and whined. The pup tried to bite him once, more from fear than aggression, but Everett just kept talking in that low, steady voice. The same one he'd used with frightened horses and injured cattle over the years. "Easy now. Easy. Just trying to help. You're going to be fine. Just got to keep still a minute longer." When the splint was secure, Everett wrapped Ash in his coat and began the long walk back to the cabin. The pup was heavier than it had been that first night, growing fast, but Everett barely noticed the weight. All he could think about was getting Ash back to warmth and safety. Shadow was waiting on the porch, pacing anxiously. When Everett appeared through the trees carrying Ash, the smaller pup ran to meet them, whining and trying to lick Ash's face. Everett let them have their reunion, then carried both pups inside and settled them by the fire. Ash couldn't put any weight on the injured leg, and the pup was clearly in pain, despite Everett's best efforts with the splint. He crushed some aspirin into elk meat and coaxed Ash to eat it, then sat back and watched the pup carefully for signs of shock or internal injury. Shadow stayed pressed against Ash, offering what comfort it could. The 2 pups had never been separated since that first night, and Shadow seemed genuinely distressed by Ash's injury. It licked Ash's ears and muzzle, whined softly, and refused to move more than a few inches away. Everett spent the next 2 days barely sleeping, monitoring Ash around the clock. The break was clean, which was fortunate, but infection was always a risk. He changed the splint daily, checking for swelling or discoloration. He made sure Ash ate and drank, even when the pup didn't want to. And he talked to both of them constantly, keeping up a steady stream of reassurance. "You're going to heal up just fine," he told Ash. "Might take a few weeks, but you're young and strong. Bone'll knit back together good as new. You'll see," to Shadow. "You're doing good, looking after your brother. That's what family does. They look after each other." The word family caught in his throat a little. Was that what they were becoming, a family? The thought felt dangerous and hopeful in equal measure. On the 3rd day, Ash tried to stand on the injured leg. The pup yelped in pain and collapsed, but the effort itself was encouraging. It meant Ash still had fight left, still had the will to recover. Everett carved a new splint from a piece of cedar, stronger and lighter than the pine he'd used initially. He carved it carefully, smoothing every edge, making sure there were no rough spots that might rub or cause discomfort. The work took him most of an afternoon, but he didn't mind. It gave his hands something useful to do. While he worked, both pups watched him from their spot by the fire. Shadow had finally relaxed enough to sleep, curled protectively around Ash, and Ash lay with its head on Shadow's flank, eyes half closed, content to rest and heal. The cedar splint, once finished, was a thing of simple beauty. Everett had shaped it to fit Ash's leg perfectly, padded it with soft leather from an old glove, and lashed it in place with rawhide strips that could be loosened or tightened as needed. It was better than anything a veterinarian could have done with the materials at hand. When he gently removed the old splint and fitted the new one, Ash barely flinched. The pup seemed to understand that Everett was helping, not hurting. That these hands, rough and scarred as they were, meant safety and care. By the end of the first week, Ash was hobbling around the cabin, putting tentative weight on the injured leg. By the end of the 2nd week, the pup was moving almost normally, though with a slight limp that might or might not be permanent, and through it all, Everett discovered something about himself that he'd forgotten. He was good at this, good at caring for living things, good at the patient, daily work of healing. He'd been a good rancher once, before grief had driven him away from that life. Good with animals, good with the land. Maybe, just maybe, he could be good at this too. The cedar splint became a reminder of that. Even after Ash had healed enough to have it removed, Everett kept it on the shelf above his bed. A small carved piece of wood that represented a turning point. The moment he'd chosen to fight for something instead of giving up. The moment he'd remembered that his hands could heal as well as fail. And every time he looked at it, he thought about the choice he'd made. Not to let Ash die, not to give up, to do the hard work of keeping something alive, even when it would have been easier to walk away. It was a lesson he'd needed to learn. And 2 wolf pups, against all odds, were teaching it to him. March arrived with a false spring that melted the top layer of snow and filled the forest with the sound of dripping water. The pups were growing at an astonishing rate. Ash and Shadow had doubled in size since that first night, their puppy awkwardness giving way to something more coordinated and powerful. They were still young, still learning, but the wolves they would become were starting to show through. Everett sat on the porch one afternoon, watching them chase each other through the slush. They were playing, but there was a seriousness to it now that hadn't been there before. The way Ash would pin Shadow and hold it down. The way Shadow would use speed and cunning to evade Ash's larger size. They were learning to hunt, even if they didn't know it yet. The mail run was coming up. Twice a year, a bush pilot named Ray Hutchins would fly supplies into a clearing about 5 miles from Everett's cabin. Ray never asked questions, never pushed for conversation. He'd just unload whatever Everett had ordered. Coffee, flour, ammunition, lamp oil, and fly back out the same day. Payment was arranged through the lawyer in Pine Ridge. Everett hadn't seen another human being in months. Part of him dreaded the encounter, even one as brief as this. But another part, a part that was growing stronger, was curious. What was happening in the world? How was Jack managing the ranch? Was anyone in Pine Ridge even asking about him anymore? He pulled out the battered 2-way radio he kept in a wooden box under his bed. It was his only connection to civilization, and he'd used it exactly twice in 3 years. Once to arrange the supply drops, and once when he'd been sick with pneumonia and thought he might die alone in the cabin. He'd almost called for help that time, but the fever had broken on its own, and he'd put the radio away. Now he switched it on, waited for it to warm up, and keyed the transmitter. "Ray, you there? This is Everett Miles, over." Static filled the cabin. Then Ray's gravelly voice came through, distant but clear. "Everett, been a while. You still breathing up there?" "Over, still breathing. Need the usual supplies, plus some extra meat if you can manage it. I'll pay the difference." Over. A pause. "Extra meat? You entertaining guests?" Over. Everett looked at Ash and Shadow, who'd stopped playing and were watching him with alert, curious eyes. "Something like that. Can you do it?" Over. "Sure thing. Day after tomorrow, same clearing. Weather looks good. Anything else?" Over. Everett hesitated. There was so much he could ask. About the ranch. About Pine Ridge. About whether anyone missed him or if they'd all moved on with their lives. "No, that's all. See you day after tomorrow." Over and out. He switched off the radio and sat in silence, the weight of that brief conversation settling over him. 2 years ago he wouldn't have called at all. Would have stretched his supplies until they ran out. Would have lived on game and melted snow and whatever he could forage. But now he had the pups to think about. They needed protein and lots of it, more than he could reliably provide with traps and the occasional deer. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay in the loft with Ash and Shadow pressed against him. They were getting too big for this, really, took up more space than they should, and thought about the choice he was making. Every time he interacted with the outside world, even in this minimal way, he risked drawing attention. Someone might wonder what he needed extra meat for. Someone might ask questions. And if anyone discovered he was keeping wolves, not dogs, but actual wolves, there would be consequences. The law was murky on such things, but Everett doubted it would work in his favor. At best, they'd take Ash and Shadow away. At worst, they'd put them down as a potential threat. The thought of losing them sent a spike of panic through his chest. When had they become so important? When had their lives become more precious to him than his own solitude? He knew the answer, though. It was that first night, when he'd wrapped them in his coat and carried them to safety. The moment he'd made the choice to save them, instead of walking away. Everything after that was just details. The next day, Everett made the 5-mile hike to the clearing to prepare for Ray's arrival. Ash and Shadow came with him, loping through the forest with increasing confidence. They were getting stronger every day, more capable. Soon they wouldn't need him at all. The thought should have been comforting. It wasn't. The clearing was empty and quiet, ringed by tall pines that creaked in the wind. Everett walked the perimeter, checking for tracks. Elk had been through here recently, a moose, judging by the deep prints near the creek. And something else, boot prints, human-made, maybe 3 or 4 days old. He knelt to examine them. A single person, probably male based on the size and depth. The prints led from the north edge of the clearing, circled around, then headed back the same way they'd come. Someone had been here. Someone had been looking around. Hunters, maybe. Or hikers. Though this was awfully remote for casual recreation. Or maybe, and this was the thought that made Everett's hands go cold, someone from Pine Ridge, coming to check on him despite his instructions to stay away. He stood and looked around the clearing with fresh eyes. Had they left anything else? Any sign of who they were or what they wanted? There, nailed to a pine tree at eye level, was a small piece of paper wrapped in plastic. Everett approached it slowly, his heart sinking. Inside the plastic was a note written in Jack Hollister's familiar scrawl. Everett, ranch is doing fine. Cattle sold well last fall. Your account is healthy. Some folks in town ask about you now and then. I tell them you're doing what you need to do. But I want you to know you're missed. Your friend Jack. Everett read the note 3 times, then carefully folded it and put it in his pocket. Jack had hiked all the way up here just to leave a message, just to let Everett know he wasn't forgotten. That people still cared, even after 3 years of silence. The gesture touched something in Everett that he'd thought was dead, some part of him that remembered what it was like to be part of a community, to have friends who worried about you, to matter to someone beyond yourself. Ash nudged his hand with a cold nose, and Everett looked down to find both pups watching him with concerned expressions. He'd been standing motionless for several minutes, lost in thought. It's all right, he told them. Just an old friend checking in. Nothing to worry about. But that was a lie, and he knew it. Because Jack's note changed things. It meant people were thinking about him. It meant his isolation wasn't as complete as he'd believed. And it meant sooner or later someone might decide to come looking in person. He thought about the wolves, growing larger every day, becoming more obviously what they were. Thought about the questions people would ask if they saw them. Thought about all the ways this fragile piece he'd built could shatter. That night, back in the cabin, Everett took out the family photograph and looked at it by lamplight. Sarah's smile, Thomas's bright eyes. The 3 of them together, frozen in a moment that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. He'd come here to punish himself, to live out his days in isolation as penance for his failures. But somehow, in the process of saving 2 orphaned wolves, he'd stumbled into something that felt almost like redemption, almost like a second chance. The question was whether he could accept it, whether he could let himself believe he deserved it. Ash and Shadow slept by the fire, their breathing deep and steady. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and Everett sat in the darkness, Jack's note heavy in his pocket, and wondered what it would cost him to try to hold on to this unexpected grace he'd been given. Ray Hutchins was a man of few words, which suited Everett just fine. The pilot brought his small Cessna in low over the trees and set it down in the clearing with barely a bounce. He was maybe 50 years old, weathered and compact, with the kind of face that had seen everything and been surprised by nothing. "Brought your supplies," Ray said, hauling boxes from the cargo hold. "And about 100 pounds of elk meat, frozen solid. Should last you a while." Everett helped unload, keeping one eye on the tree line where he'd told Ash and Shadow to wait. The pups had been reluctant to leave his side, but he'd insisted. The last thing he needed was Ray seeing them and asking questions. "Appreciate it," Everett said. "What do I owe you?" Ray named a price that was more than fair. They settled up with cash that Everett had withdrawn from his account the previous year. Then Ray paused, looking at Everett with something that might have been concern. "You doing all right up here? Looks like you've lost some weight." "I'm fine. Jack Hollister asked me to check on you. Said he left you a note." "I got it." Ray nodded slowly. "He's worried about you, Everett. Whole town is, truth be told. Been 3 years now. I know how long it's been. I'm not trying to tell you your business, Ray said carefully. But there's folks down there who'd welcome you back. Whenever you're ready. Everett felt something tighten in his chest. I'm not ready. Fair enough. Ray climbed back into the Cessna and started the engine. Over the noise, he called out, I'll be back in 6 months. You need anything before then? You know how to reach me. Everett nodded and stepped back as the plane taxied down the clearing and lifted into the air. He watched it disappear over the mountains, then turned to haul his supplies back to the cabin. Ash and Shadow emerged from the trees as soon as the plane was gone. They'd grown so much in the past month that Everett sometimes had to remind himself they were still juveniles. Ash was nearly knee-high now, with powerful shoulders and a thick coat. Shadow was smaller but faster, with intelligent eyes that seemed to track everything. They helped him carry supplies back to the cabin, or rather, they thought they were helping. Ash grabbed a bag of flour in its jaws and promptly tore it open, sending white powder everywhere. Shadow tried to drag a box that was twice its size and ended up tumbling down a slope. Everett couldn't help but smile. For all their growing size and strength, they were still pups in the ways that mattered. Back at the cabin, he stowed the supplies and began cutting the frozen elk meat into portions. The pups watched with intense interest, drool pooling on the floor. Patience, Everett told them. You'll get yours. While the meat thawed enough to cut, Everett sat on the porch and looked at the forest. Spring was truly coming now. He could feel it in the air, see it in the way the snow was receding from the south-facing slopes. In another month, maybe 2, the high country would be passable. Wildflowers would bloom. Bears would emerge from hibernation. The whole forest would wake up, and Ash and Shadow would be big enough to start hunting on their own. The thought filled him with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Pride, maybe, but also something like grief. Because once they could hunt, they wouldn't need him anymore. They could return to the wild where they belonged, The phrase felt wrong even as he thought it. Didn't they belong here with him? Hadn't they become his family in some strange, unexpected way? But that was selfish thinking, and Everett knew it. These were wild animals, not pets. They deserved to live as wolves, not as tame creatures, dependent on a lonely old man for survival. That night, after the pups had eaten their fill and settled by the fire, Everett pulled out something he hadn't looked at in years. A small wooden box carved from cherry wood with brass hinges that had tarnished to green. Inside was Thomas's compass, the one Everett had given him on his 16th birthday. It was a good compass, military grade, with a luminous dial that still glowed faintly in the dark. Thomas had carried it on every hunting trip, every backpacking adventure, every time he'd ventured into the wilderness. It had been in his pocket when he died. The sheriff had given it back to Everett after the investigation, along with Thomas's wallet and knife and the other contents of his pockets. Everett had put it all in this box and hadn't opened it since. Now he held the compass in his hand, feeling its familiar weight. The brass was cool against his palm. He opened it and watched the needle swing toward magnetic north, steady and true. Thomas had trusted this compass, had trusted Everett to teach him how to use it properly, had trusted him to keep him safe in the backcountry, and Everett had failed that trust. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the empty cabin. "God, Thomas, I'm so sorry." Ash lifted its head from the hearth, ears pricked forward. The pup watched Everett with those intelligent eyes, then stood and crossed to him. Ash pressed against Everett's leg, offering silent comfort. Shadow followed a moment later, curling up at his feet. And Everett sat there, holding his dead son's compass, 2 wolves keeping vigil with him, and let himself feel the full weight of his grief for the first time in months. It was like opening a door he'd kept locked. Behind it was every memory, every regret, every moment of that terrible day. The sound of the gunshot, the silence that followed. Thomas's body cold and still in his arms. The long walk out of the mountains, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with physical burden. But there was something else, too. Something he'd been too consumed by guilt to notice before. Thomas had died doing what he loved. He died in the wilderness he'd always been drawn to, following the passions Everett had encouraged in him. It was a tragedy, yes, an accident that should never have happened. But it wasn't murder. It wasn't malice. It was just the hard reality of wild places, where one misstep could cost everything. Could Everett have prevented it? Maybe, maybe not. He'd never know for certain. But sitting here with two wolves who trusted him completely, who depended on him for their survival, he started to understand something he'd been unable to grasp before. Sometimes you do everything right, and things still go wrong. Sometimes you love something with your whole heart, and you still lose it. That didn't mean you'd failed. It just meant you were alive in a world where loss was the price of love. He closed the compass and put it back in the box. But this time, instead of hiding it away, he set the box on the shelf where he could see it, where he could remember Thomas, not just as the son he'd lost, but as the young man he'd been, brave and curious and full of life. He would have liked you too, Everett said to the wolves. Thomas always loved animals, had a way with them, like his mother did. Ash's tail thumped against the floor. Shadow yawned, showing sharp white teeth. Get some sleep, Everett told them. Tomorrow we've got work to do. But the work he was thinking of wasn't physical. It was the harder kind, the work of learning to forgive himself, the work of accepting that he deserved to live, even after failing to save the person he loved most in the world. It was work that terrified him. Work he'd been avoiding for 3 years. But maybe, with 2 unlikely teachers showing him the way, he could finally begin. The letter arrived on a morning in early April, delivered by a young wildlife officer who hiked up to the cabin unannounced. Everett saw him coming from half a mile away and had time to lock Ash and Shadow in the loft before the officer reached the porch. "Mr. Miles, I'm Officer Derek Chen with Wyoming Game and Fish. Got a few minutes to talk." Everett's heart was pounding, but he kept his face neutral. "About what?" "May I come in?" "Rather you didn't. I'm not much for visitors." Chen nodded, seemingly unbothered. He was young, maybe 30, with the earnest expression of someone who still believed rules could solve every problem. "Fair enough. I'll get straight to it. We've received reports of wolf activity in this area. Multiple sightings over the past few weeks. You seen anything unusual?" "Lots of things are unusual in the backcountry, officer." "You'll have to be more specific." "Wolves, Mr. Miles, 2 of them juveniles, traveling together. Some hikers spotted them near the old logging road about 3 miles from here. We're trying to track their movements, make sure they're not a threat to livestock or people." Everett's mouth went dry. "Haven't seen any wolves." "You sure about that?" "Because one of the hikers said the animals seemed habituated, not afraid of humans. That's concerning from a wildlife management perspective." From inside the cabin, there was a thump as one of the wolves knocked something over. Chen's eyes flicked to the door. "What was that?" "Probably a raccoon. They get into everything if you're not careful." Chen looked skeptical. "Mr. Miles, I should tell you that keeping wild animals, especially predators like wolves, is illegal in Wyoming without proper permits. The penalties are severe. Fines, jail time, and the animals would be confiscated and likely euthanized. I'm aware of the law." "Good. Then you'll understand why I need to ask. Are you harboring wolves on this property?" Everett looked at the young officer and saw genuine concern in his eyes. This wasn't a man on a power trip. He was just doing his job, trying to protect both wildlife and people. Under different circumstances, Everett might have respected that. "No," Everett lied. "No wolves here." Chen studied him for a long moment. Then he pulled an official-looking envelope from his jacket. "This is a formal notice. We'll be conducting a wildlife survey of this area over the next 2 weeks. If we find evidence of habituated wolves, we'll have to take action. I wanted to give you advance warning." He handed Everett the envelope and stepped back. "I'm not trying to make trouble for you, Mr. Miles, but if you know something about these wolves, now's the time to tell me. Once they're classified as a threat, my hands are tied." "I appreciate the warning," Everett said, taking the envelope. Chen nodded and turned to leave. But he paused at the edge of the clearing and looked back. "For what it's worth, I heard about your son. I'm sorry for your loss, but isolating yourself up here isn't the answer. and neither is trying to replace what you lost with wild animals that can never be what you need them to be. The words hit Everett like a physical blow. You don't know anything about what I need. Maybe not. But I know wolves, and I know they belong in the wild, not in someone's cabin. Think about that. Chen disappeared into the forest, and Everett stood on the porch clutching the envelope, his hands shaking. Inside, Ash and Shadow were scratching at the loft door, whining to be let out. Everett opened it, and they bounded down, circling him anxiously, sensing his distress. He opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was an official notice detailing the wildlife survey, along with information about Wyoming's laws regarding protected species. There was also a photograph, a grainy trail camera image showing 2 wolves near a creek. Ash and Shadow, unmistakably. Everett sat down hard on the floor. The wolves pressed against him, their warm bodies offering comfort they didn't understand he needed. 2 weeks. He had 2 weeks before wildlife officers descended on this area, with tracking equipment and cameras and all the tools of modern wildlife management. They'd find Ash and Shadow. They'd take them away, and there was nothing Everett could do to stop it, unless he left. The thought came to him fully formed, as if it had been waiting in the back of his mind all along. He could take the wolves deeper into the wilderness, beyond the survey area, beyond the reach of civilization. There was country to the north that was so remote, even experienced hunters avoided it. They could disappear there, all 3 of them, and no one would find them, but that was running. And hadn't he run far enough already? Everett looked at the photograph in his hand, then at the family photo on the wall. Sarah and Thomas frozen in time, smiling at a future that would never arrive. He'd run from their memory, from the pain of loss, from the community that wanted to help him heal. And where had it gotten him? To a cabin in the wilderness with 2 wolves who would be taken from him in 2 weeks. What do I do? He asked the empty room. Ash whined and laid its head in his lap. Shadow pressed closer to his side. They trusted him completely, expected him to have answers, expected him to keep them safe. But maybe keeping them safe meant something different than he'd thought. Maybe it meant teaching them to survive without him. Maybe it meant letting them go before the authorities could take them. The idea of releasing Ash and Shadow into the wild tore at something deep in Everett's chest. They'd become his family. The reason he got up in the morning. The reason he'd started to believe he deserved to live. But Chen was right about one thing. Everett couldn't replace what he'd lost with these wolves. They were their own beings, with their own needs and destinies. And keeping them in his cabin, making them dependent on him, was just another form of selfishness. That night, Everett barely slept. He lay in the loft with Ash and Shadow beside him, listening to their breathing, trying to memorize the weight of them, the warmth, the simple comfort of not being alone. In the morning, he made a decision that broke his heart, even as he knew it was right. He would teach them to hunt, would take them deeper into the forest, and show them how to survive on their own. And then, before the wildlife survey began, he would let them go. It was the only way to save them, the only way to honor what they'd given him, this unexpected second chance at life, at purpose, at redemption. But first, he had 2 weeks to prepare them for a world without him. 2 weeks to teach them everything they needed to know. 2 weeks to say goodbye to the only family he had left. Everett stood and looked out the window at the forest, awakening in spring. Somewhere out there was a future for Ash and Shadow. If he was strong enough to give it to them, he'd failed to save his son. But maybe, just maybe, he could save these wolves. And in doing so, save whatever was left of himself. The letter from Game and Fish sat on the table, official and final. 2 weeks, 14 days. It wasn't enough time, but it would have to be. Everett turned to Ash and Shadow, who were watching him with alert, trusting eyes. "All right," he said quietly. "Time to learn what you really are." And with those words, everything changed. The next morning, Everett led Ash and Shadow 5 miles north into country he'd only explored once before. The terrain was rougher here, cut through with ravines and thick stands of deadfall that made passage difficult. But it was also rich with game. elk, mule deer, snowshoe hares. If the wolves were going to learn to hunt, this was the place to do it. He'd brought Thomas's hunting knife with him. It was a good blade, carbon steel with a bone handle worn smooth by years of use. Thomas had carried it on every hunt, had used it to dress his first deer at age 13. Now Everett wore it on his belt, a talisman and a reminder of why this mattered. The first lesson was tracking. Everett knelt beside a set of deer prints in the soft earth and motioned for the wolves to investigate. Ash approached cautiously, sniffing the tracks while Shadow hung back and watched. "Smell that?" Everett said quietly. "That's mule deer. Young buck, probably. Came through here this morning, judging by how fresh the tracks are." The wolves couldn't understand his words, but they understood the tone. Quiet, focused, serious. This was important. This was life and death. They followed the tracks for nearly an hour, moving slowly, stopping frequently to scent the air and read the signs. Ash was a natural tracker, nose to the ground, body low and intent. Shadow was more cautious, but also more observant, noticing broken branches and disturbed leaves that Ash missed. The deer had bedded down in a copse of aspen about a quarter-mile ahead. Everett spotted it first, a flash of brown against the white bark of the trees. He placed a hand on each wolf's head, holding them still, letting them see what he saw. The deer's ears twitched. It was alert, but not alarmed, unaware of the predators watching from downwind. "This is how you hunt," Everett whispered. "Patience, observation, wait for the right moment," but he didn't let them pursue. Not yet. They were still too young, too inexperienced. A full-grown mule deer could kill a wolf with one well-placed kick. Better to start smaller. Over the next 3 days, Everett taught them to hunt rabbits. He showed them how to circle prey, how to use the terrain for cover, how to coordinate their attacks. Ash was the aggressor, bold and direct. Shadow was the tactician, cutting off escape routes and driving prey toward Ash. Their first successful hunt came on the 4th day. A snowshoe hare, startled from its hiding place, ran straight into Shadow's path. The wolf reacted on instinct, pouncing and making the kill with one quick bite. Ash arrived seconds later, and the two wolves shared the meal, while Everett watched from a distance. The pride he felt was overwhelming. They were learning, growing into their true nature, becoming what they were meant to be. But with each lesson, with each successful hunt, Everett felt them pulling away from him. They were less dependent now, more confident in their own abilities. They ranged farther during their explorations, sometimes disappearing for hours, before returning to the camp he'd established. Camp, not cabin. Because he wasn't going back to the cabin. Not yet, maybe not ever. Out here, away from the survey area, they were safe. Out here, he could give them the space and time they needed to become fully wild. On the 7th day, Everett woke to find Ash and Shadow gone. He'd slept later than usual, exhausted from a week of constant movement and teaching. The wolves' sleeping spots beside him were still warm, but they were nowhere to be seen. He waited an hour, then 2. By midday, he was beginning to worry. By evening, when they still hadn't returned, he was genuinely frightened. They'd never been gone this long. Never strayed so far that they couldn't hear him call. Something was wrong. Everett grabbed Thomas's knife and set out to find them. He tracked their prints through the forest, following a trail that led north and east into progressively rougher country. The prints showed they'd been running, not hunting. Running from something or towards something, he couldn't tell. He found them 3 miles from camp, at the edge of a cliff that dropped 50 feet into a rocky gorge. They were standing at the precipice, looking down at something he couldn't see, Ash, Shadow. The wolves turned at his call, and he saw something in their eyes he'd never seen before. Fear, raw and undisguised. Everett approached carefully and looked over the edge. At the bottom of the gorge, wedged between 2 boulders, was a wolf. An adult larger than Ash or Shadow would ever be. Its leg was clearly broken, and from the blood staining the rocks around it, it had been there for some time. The adult wolf looked up at them and made a sound, a low, mournful howl that raised the hair on Everett's neck. And then he understood. This was their mother, the wolf that had died, or so he'd thought, leaving Ash and Shadow orphaned. But she hadn't died. She'd fallen, broken her leg, and crawled into this gorge to escape predators while she healed, only she hadn't healed. And her pups had found her. Ash and Shadow were whining, pacing at the cliff's edge, desperate to reach their mother, but unable to figure out how. The adult wolf howled again, a sound of pain and longing that cut straight through Everett's heart. He looked at the cliff face, assessing the descent. It was steep but not impossible. There were handholds, ledges, places where he could find purchase. He could get down there. The question was whether he should. That wolf was wild, injured and desperate. It could kill him without trying, just out of fear and pain. And even if he survived the encounter, what then? He couldn't carry a 150-pound wolf back up a cliff face. Couldn't heal a break that old. The kindest thing would be to put a bullet in the animal and end its suffering. But Ash and Shadow were looking at him with those trusting eyes, expecting him to do something, believing, in whatever way wolves understood such things, that he could fix this. Everett thought about Thomas, about carrying his son's body 4 miles through the mountains, knowing he was dead but unable to leave him behind. About the weight of failure and the impossibility of making things right after the worst had already happened. He thought about the cedar splint he'd carved for Ash, about the wooden bowls, about every small act of care and healing that had brought him back from the edge of giving up entirely. And then he took off his jacket, tested the first handhold, and began climbing down into the gorge. The descent took 20 minutes and cost him skin from both palms and a gash on his forearm from a sharp rock. But he made it to the bottom, landing hard on the loose stones. The adult wolf watched him approach, its lips pulled back in a snarl. This close, Everett could see it was female, probably 6 or 7 years old, with a thick grey coat and amber eyes that held both intelligence and agony. "Easy," Everett said softly. "Easy, Mother. I'm here to help." He'd brought nothing with him, no rope, no medical supplies, no way to immobilize the animal. All he had was Thomas's knife and whatever he could improvise from his surroundings. The wolf's leg was badly broken, the bone protruding through matted fur. Infected, certainly. Probably gangrenous. In any rational assessment, the wolf was beyond saving, but Everett had stopped being rational the moment he'd found 2 orphaned pups by a frozen creek and decided to bring them home. He fashioned a splint from branches and strips torn from his shirt. The mother wolf tried to bite him twice, but her heart wasn't in it. She was too weak, too far gone. She let him work on her leg, whimpering occasionally, but mostly just watching him with those intelligent eyes. When the splint was in place, crude but functional, Everett sat back and assessed the situation. The wolf couldn't climb. He couldn't carry her. They were both stuck at the bottom of this gorge, and night was coming on fast. Above, Ash and Shadow watched anxiously from the cliff's edge. "Go back to camp," Everett called up to them. "Go on, I'll be fine." But they didn't move. Just sat there keeping vigil, refusing to abandon either their mother or the human who'd saved them. Everett looked at the mother wolf, then at her pups silhouetted against the darkening sky, then at Thomas's knife in his hand. 3 years ago, he'd failed to save his son, had carried Thomas's body out of the wilderness and spent every day since wondering what he could have done differently. But here, now in this gorge with a dying wolf and her orphaned pups watching from above, he had a chance to do something different, to fight for a life instead of mourning its loss, to choose hope over despair, even when the odds were impossible. He settled in beside the mother wolf, sharing what warmth he had, and prepared to spend the night at the bottom of a cliff in the Wyoming wilderness. It was probably the stupidest thing he'd ever done. It was also the most important, and as stars began to appear overhead and the temperature dropped toward freezing, Everett Miles smiled for the first time in 3 years, because he'd finally found something worth dying for. Which meant, by some strange logic, he'd also found something worth living for. Dawn came cold and clear. Everett woke to find the mother wolf still breathing, still alive despite the odds. Frost covered both of them, and his joints ached from sleeping on stone, but he was alive too. That counted for something. The wolf's eyes opened when he stirred. She watched him warily, but without the fear from the night before. Something had shifted between them in the darkness. Some understanding had been reached. Everett examined her leg in the morning light. The splint had held, but the infection was worse. He could smell it now, the sweet, rotten scent of dying tissue. Without antibiotics, without proper medical care, the wolf would die. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon, unless he could get her out of this gorge and down to civilization. The thought stopped him cold. Civilization. He'd avoided it for 3 years, had built his entire existence around staying as far from other people as possible. But the nearest veterinarian was in Jackson Hole, 70 miles away. The nearest hospital with the supplies he'd need was even farther. He looked up at the cliff face. Ash and Shadow were still there, had apparently spent the night on the rim keeping watch. Their loyalty broke his heart and strengthened his resolve in equal measure. "I'm going to get her out," he called up to them. "Going to need your help, though." The pups cocked their heads, not understanding the words, but recognizing the determination in his voice. Everett spent the next hour fashioning a travois from dead branches and the remains of his shirt. It wouldn't hold together for long, but it didn't need to. Just long enough to drag the mother wolf to the gentler slope 100 yards east, where the gorge walls weren't as steep. The wolf didn't fight when he positioned the travois beneath her. She was too weak now, drifting in and out of consciousness. Her breathing had become labored, and her gums were pale. Time was running out. Everett dragged the travois across the rocky floor of the gorge, his hands bleeding, his back screaming in protest. Every few minutes he had to stop and rest, gasping for breath in the thin mountain air. He was 67 years old, and not as strong as he used to be. But he was stubborn, and stubbornness counted for something. It took 2 hours to reach the slope. By then, the mother wolf's breathing had become shallow and rapid. Everett checked her pulse, weak but steady. She was fighting. "Still trying to survive? That's it," he told her. "Keep fighting." Just a little longer. The climb up the slope was brutal. Everett had to pull the travois a few feet at a time, bracing himself against rocks, using roots for handholds. His muscles trembled with exhaustion. His vision blurred. But he kept climbing because stopping meant giving up, and he'd done enough of that for one lifetime. Ash and Shadow met him at the top, circling anxiously, whining and licking their mother's face. The adult wolf's eyes flickered open and focused on her pups. She made a soft sound in her throat, recognition, affection, relief. Then her eyes closed again. Everett collapsed beside the travois, his chest heaving. He'd made it. They were out of the gorge. But they were still miles from help, and the mother wolf was fading fast. He pulled out his two-way radio, had brought it with him, miracle of miracles, in his jacket pocket. His hands shook as he switched it on. Ray Hutchins, you there? This is Everett Miles. Emergency, over." Static crackled. Then, "Everett? What's wrong?" "Over. Need an emergency extraction." "My location is—" He gave the coordinates from memory. Years of navigation in these mountains, making the numbers automatic. "I have an injured wolf. Critical condition. Need to get to a vet in Jackson Hole. How fast can you get here?" "Over." A long pause. "Did you say wolf?" "Over. Yes, a wolf. Her leg's broken and infected. She's dying. Can you help or not?" "Over." Another pause. When Ray's voice came back, it was measured and careful. "Everett, you know I have to report this. Game and Fish will want to know." "Over." Everett looked at the mother wolf, at Ash and Shadow pressed against her sides. At this family he'd helped save, who'd saved him in return. "I know," he said quietly. "Report it. Tell them everything. I don't care anymore. Just help me save her, please." "Over." The radio was silent for what felt like an eternity. "Then give me 90 minutes. I'll be there." "Over and out." Everett switched off the radio and sat back. It was done. He'd exposed himself, exposed the wolves, invited all the consequences he'd been trying to avoid. But for the first time in 3 years, he felt at peace with his choices. Ray arrived in 80 minutes, landing the Cessna on a stretch of relatively flat ground that Everett wouldn't have believed could serve as a runway. Officer Derek Chen was with him, along with a wildlife veterinarian named Dr. Sarah Kwan. Everett stood as they approached, positioning himself between them and the wolves. Ash and Shadow growled low in their throats, sensing danger. "Easy," Chen said, holding up both hands. "We're here to help." Dr. Quan knelt beside the mother wolf, her movements calm and professional. She examined the leg, checked vital signs, listened to the wolf's breathing. After a moment, she looked up at Everett. "You did good work with that splint. Probably saved her life, at least temporarily. But she needs surgery, antibiotics, IV fluids. I can stabilize her here, but we need to get her to my clinic fast. Will she make it? I don't know, but she's got a better chance than she did at the bottom of that gorge." Dr. Quan opened her field kit and began working, injecting antibiotics, setting up a portable IV, immobilizing the leg properly. Chen watched Ash and Shadow with a mixture of professional assessment and something that might have been admiration. "These are the pups from the trail camera photos. You've been keeping them." It wasn't a question, but Everett answered anyway. "Found them by a creek, nearly frozen to death. Their mother had abandoned them. Or so I thought. So you brought them in, raised them, kept them alive. There's a difference." Chen was quiet for a moment, watching the two young wolves press close to their mother. "Mr. Miles, you understand the position this puts me in. You've violated multiple wildlife regulations. I should be confiscating these animals and citing you for—" "I know what you should be doing," Everett interrupted, "and I'm not going to fight you. But before you make your decision, I want you to understand something." He paused, gathering his thoughts. 3 years ago, I lost my son in these mountains. Hunting accident. He was 19 years old and I couldn't save him. I came up here to disappear because I thought I deserved to be alone. Thought I deserved to suffer for failing him. Chen's expression softened slightly. "I heard about that." "I'm sorry. I found these pups the same night I decided I was done, ready to walk into the woods and not come back. But they needed me, and somehow that made me realize I wasn't as useless as I thought. They gave me a reason to keep breathing. I understand that, Mr. Miles, but the law says they're wild animals and I had no right to interfere. And you're correct. But here's the thing." Everett looked at Ash and Shadow, who were watching him with those trusting eyes. "I didn't save them for me. I saved them because it was right. Because leaving them to die would have been wrong, law or no law. And if I had to do it again, I'd make the same choice." Dr. Quan had finished her work on the mother wolf. "She's stable enough to move. We need to go now if we're going to save her." Ray helped load the wolf onto the plane while Ash and Shadow whined and paced. They didn't understand what was happening, why their mother was being taken away. Everett knelt beside them and placed a hand on each of their heads. "She's going to be okay. They're going to help her. But you can't come with us." "Not yet." Chen watched this interaction, his face unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "Mr. Miles, I'm going to be straight with you. By the book, I should confiscate these pups and issue citations that would likely result in jail time. But Dr. Quan here has a wildlife rehabilitation facility. It's licensed for exactly this kind of situation, orphaned or injured predators that need care before being released." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we could classify these pups as rescued wildlife in need of rehabilitation. You'd be their temporary custodian under Dr. Quan's supervision until they're ready for release. It's not ideal, but it's legal, and it gives them the best chance at a successful return to the wild." Everett looked at Chen, seeing him clearly for the first time, not as an antagonist, but as someone trying to do right by both the law and the living creatures it was meant to protect. "And their mother? If she survives, and that's a big if, same thing. Rehabilitation and eventual release." Chen paused. "You'd have to agree to cooperate fully. Regular check-ins, documentation following Dr. Quan's protocols. And when it's time to let them go, you'd have to actually let them go. Can you do that?" Everett thought about Thomas, about holding on to grief so tightly it had nearly killed him, about the years he'd wasted punishing himself for something he couldn't change. He thought about these wolves, who'd given him back his life without asking for anything in return, except food and warmth and basic kindness. "Yes," he said quietly. "When it's time, I'll let them go." Chen extended his hand. Everett took it and they shook, not as adversaries, but as men who understood that sometimes the right thing isn't the easy thing. "Then let's get that wolf to Jackson Hole," Chen said. "You coming?" Everett looked back at the wilderness that had been his home and prison for 3 years. Then he looked at Ash and Shadow, who needed him to be brave enough to face the world he'd run from. "Yeah," he said, "I'm coming." 6 months later, Everett stood at the edge of a meadow in the northern Wyoming wilderness, watching 3 wolves disappear into the timber. The mother, fully healed, her legs strong again, led the way. Ash and Shadow followed, pausing once to look back at the man who'd saved them. Everett raised his hand in farewell. Then the wolves were gone, vanishing into the forest as if they'd never existed. Dr. Kwan stood beside him, her equipment already packed for the journey back to Jackson Hole. "They'll be fine. That mother knows this territory. She'll teach them everything they need to know." "I know," Everett said. And he did know. But that didn't make it any easier. They hiked back to where Ray waited with the plane. The flight to Jackson Hole was quiet, each person lost in their own thoughts. But when they landed, Jack Hollister was waiting at the airstrip, leaning against his truck with a cautious smile. "Thought you might need a ride back to Pine Ridge," Jack said. Everett looked at his old foreman, his friend, and felt something loosen in his chest. "I'd appreciate that." The drive took 2 hours. They talked about the ranch, about cattle prices and weather patterns, and all the ordinary things that make up a life. They didn't talk about Thomas, or grief, or the 3 years Everett had spent in isolation. There would be time for that later. For now, it was enough to just be 2 old friends driving through country they both loved. Pine Ridge looked exactly as Everett remembered it. The same broad main street, the same mountains rising in the distance, the same white church with its simple steeple. He'd expected it to feel foreign, alienating. Instead, it felt like coming home. Jack drove him to the ranch. The house was clean. Jack had been maintaining it, but empty in the way houses get when no one lives in them. Sarah's reading glasses still sat on the kitchen table. Thomas's room was still exactly as he'd left it. But now, instead of suffocating grief, Everett felt something different. Gratitude for the years he'd had with them. Sorrow for what was lost, yes, but also recognition that love doesn't end just because life does. He found the family photograph in the cabin, the one he'd looked at every morning and every night for 3 years. He brought it back to the ranch house and set it on the mantel in the living room, where it belonged. That evening, Reverend Michaels stopped by with a casserole. Then Emma Thornton, his son's old teacher. Then others from town, a quiet procession of people who'd waited 3 years for him to come back and were too kind to say, "I told you so." Everett accepted their kindness with grace. Told them about the wolves, about the cabin, about the long road back from the edge of giving up. They listened without judgment. These people who'd known him his whole life and had never stopped caring even when he'd vanished. The next morning, Everett drove out to the cemetery where Sarah and Thomas were buried. Their headstones were simple granite markers, weathered now by 3 Wyoming winters. He knelt in the grass between them and finally said the words he'd been unable to speak for so long. "I'm sorry I left. Sorry I ran instead of grieving. Sorry I wasted 3 years being angry at myself for something I couldn't prevent." He paused, gathering himself. "But I want you to know I'm going to be okay now. I found something up there in the wilderness. Found myself, maybe. Found a reason to keep going." The wind moved through the pine trees overhead. A meadowlark sang from a fence post. Life continuing as it always does, whether we're ready for it or not. Everett pulled Thomas's compass from his pocket, the one he'd carried with him through everything. He opened it and watched the needle settle on north, steady and true. Then he set it carefully at the base of Thomas's headstone. "You don't need this anymore," he said quietly. "And neither do I." He stood and walked back to his truck. Jack was waiting, having followed at a respectful distance. "You ready?" Jack asked. "Ready for what?" "Well, I figure you've got a ranch to run, cattle to buy, fences to mend. All the usual work." Jack paused. "Unless you're planning on heading back to that cabin." Everett looked at the mountains rising in the distance. Somewhere up there, 3 wolves were learning to live wild and free. And here, in this valley he'd called home for most of his life, people were waiting for him to rejoin the world. "No," he said finally. "I'm not going back." This is where I belong." They drove to the ranch in comfortable silence. The sun was setting over the Absaroka Range, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. The same sky Everett had watched from his cabin window for 3 winters. The same sky that covered both the wilderness and the valley, connecting all the places and all the versions of himself he'd been. That night, Everett slept in his own bed for the first time in 3 years. But before he did, he stood at his bedroom window and looked out at the stars. He thought about Ash and Shadow and their mother, curled together somewhere in the high country. Thought about the trust they'd given him and the lessons they'd taught him, that grief doesn't have to be the end, that love can survive loss, that sometimes the things we save end up saving us, that it's never too late to come home, as long as we're brave enough to walk through the door. In the morning, he'd start rebuilding his life, reconnecting with his community, finding purpose in the daily work of ranching, honoring Sarah and Thomas not by hiding from their memory, but by living fully despite their absence. But tonight he was content to stand at the window and remember 2 wolf pups whimpering by a frozen creek, to remember the choice he'd made that changed everything, to remember that sometimes the smallest acts of mercy can save more than one life. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and somewhere in the wilderness 3 wolves ran free, and Everett Miles, who'd learned to sleep with wolves and in doing so remembered how to live, smiled in the darkness and felt at peace.